The Soviet air defense officer watches his radar screen go dark at the exact moment a small aircraft crosses into restricted airspace and does nothing. 18-year-old Matthias Rust is trimming fuel mixture at 500 feet, his auxiliary tanks giving him the range for the 550-mile journey. He's counting on something the Soviets spent 40 years and billions of rubles building. A system so complex, so layered with redundancy, that it has a fatal blind spot. Over 5 hours, one rented Cessna, and a bet that the world's most paranoid military apparatus won't shoot down what it can't categorize. Border guards see him. Fighter pilots are scrambled. Radar stations track intermittent contact. But somewhere in the chain between detection and decision, between protocol and permission, the machine hesitates. By the time he drops below the tree line for his final approach, hundreds of Soviet officers, including the Minister of Defense himself, will lose their jobs. But right now, over. Pskov, the only question is whether the flaw he's exploiting is incompetence or something they built into the system on purpose. On May 13, 1987, Matthias Rust walks into a flying club at Ederson Airfield outside Hamburg. He has 50 hours in his logbook and a private pilot certificate issued 8 months earlier. He rents a Cessna 172P Skyhawk, a high-wing, single-engine trainer used for student cross-country flights. The rental agreement lists the aircraft as DECJB, registration current, insurance paid. According to available records, Rust signed out the aircraft for an extended tour of Northern Europe, reportedly lasting several weeks. He files a visual flight rules plan for what he describes as a multi-stop journey through Scandinavia and the North Atlantic. Routine general aviation, no diplomatic clearance required. The flying club manager later recalls that Rust seemed calm, methodical, and asked no unusual questions. He was just another low-time pilot building cross-country experience. He was flying a lawnmower with wings into the most defended airspace on Earth. The Cessna 172P, a standard model, carries about 40 usable gallons, but Rust's aircraft had been modified with auxiliary fuel tanks to extend its range. A 4-cylinder Lycoming 0320 engine producing 160 horsepower. No autopilot. No navigation radio beyond a basic VOR receiver. No oxygen system. At cruise power, 8.5 gallons per hour at 122 knots true airspeed. Do the math. With his modified fuel capacity, roughly 5 hours of endurance. 0 reserve. Lean it aggressively to maximum endurance mixture, and the burn drops to 7.2 gallons per hour, perhaps 6 hours total. Still no reserve. Stall speed, 47 knots. Maximum altitude without supplemental oxygen, 14,000 feet. Every decision Rust makes for the next 7 hours will be governed by these numbers. One miscalculation, and he's swimming in the Baltic. Or worse, landing in Soviet territory. Rust lands in Helsinki on schedule, refuels to full tanks, and according to his filed flight plan, is cleared for Stockholm. He does not file a return flight plan. The next morning, May 28th, he tops off the fuel again, 42 gallons, and departs Helsinki-Malmi Airport under VFR. Finnish air traffic control clears him for the Stockholm route, with specific heading instructions. He turns east over the Gulf of Finland. 20 minutes later, Helsinki control loses radio contact. What happens next is disputed. Some sources suggest it was initially logged as a routine communication failure, but Finnish authorities quickly escalated the situation, launching a search and rescue operation when an oil slick was spotted near his last known position. By the time they notify the flying club, Rust is 60 miles inside Soviet airspace. Rust descends to 300 feet above the water, low enough that the curvature of the Earth blocks line of sight to Soviet coastal radar stations. At this altitude, the radar horizon is roughly 25 miles. He stays outside that bubble until he is directly opposite the Estonian coast, then turns southeast and crosses the beach at wave-top height, His airspeed is 120 knots. He reportedly maintained a southeasterly heading during the crossing. He climbs to 500 feet to clear trees and power lines, following ground landmarks, likely a railway line or local road, as he moved inland. He has no radio contact, no transponder signal, no flight plan filed with Soviet authorities. He is simply there. Rust is alone at low altitude, flying a rented Cessna in the late afternoon light. What he doesn't know? He's already inside the most expensive defense system ever built. Soviet PVO Strany, the Air Defense Forces, operates an integrated network of early warning radars, surface-to-air missile batteries, and interceptor bases covering 8.6 million square miles. Cost? More than 200 billion rubles over 4 decades. Rust rented his plane using personal savings and borrowed money from a West German flying club. The system is optimized for threats above 15,000 feet, traveling faster than 400 knots. Strategic bombers, cruise missiles, high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. Radar stations are spaced to provide overlapping coverage, with data fused at regional command centers and relayed to interceptor alert facilities within 90 seconds of detection. Every component designed for one assumption: any penetrator will be fast, high, and large. Rust is slow, low, and small. There is no protocol for a single slow-moving target at 500 feet. He's invisible not because he's clever, but because no one spent 200 billion rubles imagining him. Soviet radar systems were designed to filter out low-altitude returns to reduce clutter from weather, birds, and civilian traffic. According to available records, targets flying low and slow could be categorized as non-threatening anomalies, though the exact thresholds varied by system and location. Without such filtering, operators would face thousands of false alarms daily. But this created a vulnerability. A small aircraft maintaining low altitude and civilian-like speed might not trigger immediate alerts, even when crossing restricted airspace. Historical accounts suggest that Rust's flight profile placed him in precisely this gray zone, where detection occurred, but response protocols faltered. While Soviet radar did generate a track for the Cessna, the combination of his altitude, speed, and the aircraft's civilian signature led to repeated misidentification along the chain of command. In September 1983, Soviet interceptors shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it strayed into restricted airspace, killing 269 civilians. The international outcry forced Moscow to revise its rules of engagement. New standing orders require visual identification before firing on any ambiguous target. But Soviet interceptors, MiG-23s and Su-15s, stall at 140 knots and cannot safely descend below 1,000 feet. They cannot match the Cessna's speed or altitude without risking a departure stall. The doctrine change created a procedural gap. Targets that fly too low and too slow cannot be visually identified, and without identification, they cannot be engaged. Rust's planned route from Helsinki to Moscow is 550 statute miles. Flying at cruising speed, he calculated the journey would take several hours, though the actual flight would prove considerably longer. A standard Cessna 172 has an endurance of roughly 5 to 6 hours, but Rust had modified his aircraft, removing the rear seats and installing auxiliary fuel tanks that extended his range significantly. Still, every decision would be a trade between invisibility and endurance. If he climbed above 2,000 feet to avoid weather and got intercepted, the fuel-spent maneuvering could leave him short. If he stayed low and fought a stronger headwind than forecast, he risked running dry over hostile territory. There was no room for major navigation error, limited reserve for unexpected circumstances, no realistic option to divert to an alternate airport. At approximately 12:21 local time, according to flight records, Rust departs Helsinki-Malmi Airport. He climbs to 2,500 feet, turns east over the Gulf of Finland, and then descends to 300 feet above the water. Finnish radar tracks him for 18 minutes, then loses contact as he drops below their coverage. He pulls the mixture control back until the engine runs rough, then enriches it 1 notch. This lean of peak technique cuts fuel flow from 8.5 to 7.2 gallons per hour. The engine temperature climbs slightly, but it stays within limits. He is trading thermal margin for time. At this setting, he can stay airborne for 5.8 hours. Moscow is 4.5 hours away. A Soviet radar site near Kotla Yarve, 30 miles inside Estonia, paints an intermittent contact at 2,000 feet. Rust has climbed to clear a weather cell. The operator sees 3 sweeps, then the track disappears when Rust descends again below 1,000 feet. He logs it as a weather anomaly, not a border violation. Soviet doctrine requires 3 consecutive sweeps with consistent heading and speed before a track is classified as a potential threat. In a brief maneuver lasting roughly a minute and a half, Rust climbs and descends. Not long enough. The operator returns to monitoring higher altitude traffic. Rust, now at an altitude often cited as between 500 and 1,000 feet, continues southeast, navigating by prominent ground features including the railway line toward his destination. 2 hours into Soviet airspace, Rust is 220 miles inland, following roads and railroad tracks for visual navigation. Using his radio compass, he monitors Soviet navigation beacons while maintaining radio silence. His fuel gauges read half full, which matches his pre-calculated burn. He has seen no interceptors, no helicopters, no sign that anyone knows he is there. He crosses a regional airport near Pskov at 800 feet. Ground personnel later report hearing a small engine, but assume it is a local agricultural aircraft. Rust descends again to 500 feet. He was now committed to his destination. Turning back would leave him with dangerously low fuel reserves. Around mid-afternoon, a radar station near Godov paints a contact at 2,400 feet, heading southeast at 120 knots. This time, the track holds for 4 minutes. The duty officer alerts Soviet Air Defense Command, which orders a visual intercept. A MiG-23 scrambles from Tapa Air Base, approximately 40 miles away. The pilot is vectored toward the contact and descends to 3,000 feet. He acquires a radar lock but cannot see the target visually through the haze. Ground control clears him to descend to 1,500 feet. At that altitude, his approach speed is 180 knots minimum. He cannot slow below 160 knots without risking a stall. Rust is flying 120 knots. The MiG overshoots. The Cessna 172's radar cross-section is approximately 1 square meter, roughly the same as a large bird or a weather balloon. Soviet S-200 and S-300 surface-to-air missile radars are tuned to detect bomber-sized targets, which present 20 to 40 square meters of return. According to technical assessments, the radars were believed to be configured to filter small returns to reduce false alarms, though declassified records reveal the aircraft was in fact detected and assigned a combat track number. In certain sectors, the Cessna was intermittently lost in ground clutter or misidentified by operators as non-hostile traffic. The confusion was not purely technical. The system was built to stop strategic bombers, not single-engine trainers, and human operators struggled to reconcile what their screens were showing them with the threat they'd been trained to expect. The MiG-23 pilot drops to 1,000 feet. He's flying a machine built to intercept nuclear bombers at Mach 2. His target? A 19-year-old in a Cessna doing 120 knots. There's a problem. His minimum controllable speed at this altitude is 140 knots, 20 knots faster than Rust. If he slows down any further, he stalls. The interceptor cannot slow down. The Cessna cannot speed up. The gap is mechanical, not procedural. He's hunting something his aircraft was never designed to catch. Soviet doctrine assumes any low-altitude penetrator will be a cruise missile traveling 400 to 500 knots. The PVO's algorithms discard slow movers as civilian traffic. At 120 knots, Rust's contact reads as inconsistent with a missile profile, low threat priority. The system isn't designed to track something that slow at that altitude. And now, A pilot trained for supersonic interception can't even match speed with a teenager in a trainer. The MiG pilot radios ground control requesting a second pass. He climbs, turns, and approaches from a different vector. By the time he rolls out on heading, Rust has descended to 400 feet and dropped off radar. The MiG pilot scans visually, but sees nothing. According to the pilot's report, he identified the contact as a Yak-12 sports plane, though radar controllers would later misidentify the slow-moving blip as a civilian helicopter. Ground control logs the intercept as inconclusive and orders the MiG to return to base. The standing order is clear: do not fire without visual confirmation. The pilot did not get confirmation. Rust continues southeast, unaware that an interceptor passed 2,000 feet above him 5 minutes earlier. He's flying in the radar's blind spot, and it's not luck. Soviet radar systems used filters to reduce ground clutter. Low-altitude, slow-moving targets were significantly harder to detect. Rust reportedly maintained altitudes that made him difficult to track, often flying low enough to slip beneath effective detection thresholds. When weather forced him to climb higher, he briefly reappeared on their screens, then descended again and vanished. The operators aren't asleep. The system is doing exactly what it was built to do: struggle with small, low-flying aircraft. The Soviet air defense network was not broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. The radars detected the Cessna multiple times. Interceptors were scrambled twice. Ground controllers followed Doctrine. But something wasn't adding up. Every protocol was executed. Every station reported contact. Yet the plane kept flying. The system was built to counter a specific threat: high-altitude bombers and supersonic cruise missiles. It filtered out low-altitude, slow-moving contacts because tracking them would have generated thousands of false alarms every day. The rules of engagement required visual identification, but no interceptor could match the Cessna's speed at low altitude. Rust wasn't slipping through cracks. He was flying through a gap the Soviets had built into their own system, and no one on the ground had realized it yet. Approximately 5 hours into his flight, Rust's fuel gauges showed he had burned through a significant portion of his supply, though his modified Cessna's auxiliary tanks still held roughly 2 hours of endurance. Moscow's city center lay ahead. He climbed to 1,200 feet to identify landmarks. He saw the Moscow River, then the Kremlin's red walls. He had no radio contact, no clearance, and no alternate. The approach would be challenging. He would need to find a clear spot to set down, circling low over the square to identify a safe landing area. The margin for error was razor thin. Soviet Air Defense Commander at Moscow District orders a second intercept. According to available records, 2 interceptors scramble from bases west of the capital. Some accounts place them at Kubinka, 40 miles out, though Soviet military logs suggest they likely launched from Rzhev, much further northwest. The pilots are vectored toward a contact at 1,200 feet, heading east at 115 knots. They descend to 2,000 feet, but cannot acquire visual contact in the haze. Historical accounts describe the lead pilot requesting permission to fire on radar contact alone, with ground control denying the request. The standing order is clear: visual identification required. Without it, there is no engagement authority. The MiGs orbit overhead as Rust descends below 1,000 feet and vanishes from their scopes again. They are ordered to return to base. Rust identifies the Kremlin by its red brick walls and the gold domes of its cathedrals. He circles the square several times at low altitude, judging wind direction by smoke from chimneys and the movement of flags. Red Square is a cobblestone plaza approximately 1,100 feet long, bordered by Lenin's tomb to the west and the GUM department store to the east. There are no runway markings, no approach lights, no radio guidance. Rust has practiced short-field landings, but never on cobblestone, never with no go-around option, and never with a crowd of tourists watching. He enters a standard left downwind pattern as though landing at a rural airstrip. Airspeed 70 knots, flaps full. Rust lines up his approach toward the bridge adjacent to Red Square. Airspeed 60 knots. The Cessna's stall speed is 47 knots with full flaps, so he has 13 knots of margin. According to reconstructions of the landing, he descends to just feet above the pavement of the Bolshoi-Moskvoretsky Bridge. He flares, holds the nose up, and the main wheels make contact with the bridge surface. The pavement is uneven, and the airplane bounces once. He holds the stick back to keep the nose wheel off the ground, applies full brakes, and comes to a stop after a short landing roll. He parks near St. Basil's Cathedral at the southern end of the square. Engines still running. His modified auxiliary fuel tanks had given him the range he needed for the journey. Tourists and passersby quickly gather around the plane, while Soviet authorities appear initially uncertain how to respond. Rust pulls the mixture to idle cutoff. The engine sputters and stops. He sets the parking brake, unbuckles his harness, and opens the cockpit door. Curious onlookers begin to gather around the small aircraft. According to historical accounts, it would be nearly an hour before Soviet militia and KGB officers arrived to take him into custody. He steps out onto the cobblestone with his passport, pilot certificate, and a camera in hand. Charges? Hooliganism, illegal entry, and violation of international flight rules. He is taken to Lefortovo prison. The Cessna is cordoned off and will remain on Red Square for 2 hours while forensic teams photograph it and search for explosives. None are found. It is a rented trainer, modified with auxiliary fuel tanks that had carried him across hundreds of miles of Soviet airspace. Within 72 hours, Mikhail Gorbachev dismisses Marshal Sergei Sokolov, the Soviet defense minister, along with the commander of Soviet Air Defense Forces. More than 150 senior officers are relieved of command or forced into early retirement. It is the largest peacetime purge of Soviet military leadership since Stalin. Gorbachev frames the dismissals as evidence that the Soviet system is sclerotic, resistant to reform, and in need of restructuring. The incident becomes a public justification for glasnost and perestroika. In his defense, Sokolov reportedly maintained that the air defense network had functioned correctly, but that existing doctrine had not been designed to handle a target profile like Rust's. Rust is held in Lefortovo prison for 14 months. In September 1987, he is tried in a Soviet court on charges of hooliganism, illegal entry, and violation of international flight rules. He is sentenced to 4 years in a labor camp. During the trial, he testifies that his motive was to promote peace and dialogue between East and West. Prosecutors argue the flight was a propaganda stunt coordinated by Western intelligence. No evidence of intelligence involvement is presented. In August 1988, Gorbachev orders Rust's release as a goodwill gesture during diplomatic outreach to West Germany. Rust returns to Hamburg after serving 14 months. They scramble to fix what Rust broke. Soviet air defense protocols were reportedly adjusted to better detect low-altitude targets, the very vulnerability that let him slip through. Any unidentified aircraft within 100 kilometers of Moscow must now be intercepted. No exceptions. Size doesn't matter. Speed doesn't matter. Reports suggest the military leadership sought to streamline engagement procedures to prevent a repeat of the hesitation that allowed Rust to reach the capital. The system is no longer built solely for high-altitude bombers. The gap Rust exploited? Closed. But here's the thing. They're rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. Within 5 years, the Soviet Union will dissolve. The PVO Strany will cease to exist. All these protocol revisions, all these new thresholds, they're updates to a system that's already dying. Rust didn't just expose a technical flaw, he exposed something deeper, a sclerotic empire that couldn't adapt fast enough to survive. The Cessna is disassembled and stored in a Moscow military hangar. According to historical records, the aircraft was eventually returned to Germany in October 1987, where it was subsequently sold. The complete aircraft changed hands in 1988, purchased by a Japanese company. Years later, the German Museum of Technology in Berlin acquired the Cessna and undertook a full restoration. By 2009, the aircraft was displayed in its complete, assembled form. The registration DECJB was later reassigned to a different aircraft. The Cessna that flew 550 miles into Soviet airspace and landed on Red Square survives today, restored and preserved, a tangible reminder of the air defense system it defeated.
Rust's flight is not a story of espionage or recklessness. It is a demonstration that every engineered system optimized for one threat profile will have a blind spot. The Soviet air defense network was the most expensive and sophisticated in the world, but it was designed to counter strategic bombers and cruise missiles. It filtered out low-altitude, slow-moving targets because tracking them would have made the system unusable. Rust exploited a necessary trade-off in radar design, but historical accounts suggest that technical limitations alone don't explain his success. He was reportedly detected multiple times and even intercepted by fighters, yet procedural failures and misidentification in the chain of command allowed him to continue. The lesson applies beyond Cold War radar. Any system with finite resources and competing priorities will have gaps. The question is not whether the gaps exist, but whether you understand them well enough to defend them or to exploit them.